the desolate town that still waits, the forgotten town. In the heart of the American wilderness, where the fog never seemed to lift and the wind whispered like a distant mourning, there lay a town, forgotten, abandoned, and silent. No one knew its true name, for it had been long lost to time, a name now only muttered by old souls who remember things best left untouched. They say it was once a thriving place, built at the edge of the great swamp, surrounded by thick trees that stretched high enough to scrape the heavens themselves. But something happened there, something dark and unspeakable, and the town was swallowed by it, left behind like a forgotten dream. It was on a cold, moonless night, when the wind carried the scent of pine and rot, that young Henry Jacobs, a curious wanderer from a nearby town, set foot into the ruins. He had heard the stories, those murmured warnings that gripped the bones of every elder in the region. Stories of people who went in search of the town, never to return, and of those who came back, their eyes hollow, voices shaking, forever marked by the land. But Henry, with his restless spirit and a heart full of skepticism, thought those stories little more than overblown warnings meant to keep foolish souls from wandering too far into the wild. He had traveled far and wide, seen strange things and heard stranger tales. What could a small, abandoned town possibly have that could frighten him? After all, he had faced wolves, crossed rivers in flood, and even braved the deepest forests without fear. A ghost story? That didn't bother him. As Henry walked along the crumbling path, the trees seemed to grow taller, their twisted limbs reaching out like fingers trying to hold him back. The air grew colder with each step, and the once distant town now stood ahead of him, shrouded in a thick mist. He noticed the buildings were strange, made of stone that had long since turned gray, as though time itself had withered them away. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the void, and the roads had been overtaken by wild vines and weeds. There was no sign of life. No birds, no animals, no signs of even the smallest creature. Just a thick silence that seemed unnatural, as if the very earth had ceased its breathing. Henry's heart began to quicken, but he shook it off. It was just the unknown. Nothing more. He passed through what seemed to be a town square, where a broken fountain stood in the center, its stone bowl cracked and empty. The wind howled, causing the remnants of what might have once been flags or banners to flap like tattered ghosts in the breeze. But there were no sounds of life. No laughter, no voices. Just the echo of his own footsteps, which seemed unnaturally loud. It wasn't until he passed the old church at the far end of the square that he noticed something strange. The door to the church was ajar. Henry paused. The eerie stillness of the town suddenly felt more suffocating. There was no reason for the door to be open. No reason at all. Curiosity got the best of him, and he approached the church, his footsteps now careful, as though treading on fragile ground. The air grew heavier, the scent of decay stronger as he pushed the door open. It creaked in protest, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The pews were rotting, the floorboards warped and broken. Yet, in the center of the room, something stood out, an old, dusty altar that seemed untouched by time. At the foot of the altar lay a strange object, an object wrapped in tattered cloth. It was odd, almost too perfectly placed for something left behind so long ago. Henry moved closer, his heart pounding. The cloth felt unnaturally cold beneath his fingertips as he lifted it, revealing a small, ornate box. The metal was dark and tarnished, the edges covered in intricate designs. As he held it, a wave of unease washed over him, and the faintest whisper seemed to float through the air, too faint to fully understand, but enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to set the box back down, but the moment his fingers brushed against it, a loud crash echoed from outside, followed by a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Henry froze, his breath caught in his chest. The town felt different now. It wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting. Watching. And whatever had been waiting, whatever had been left behind, was stirring. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the cracked window near the altar, something that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the play of light from the distant moon. It was something living. Henry's pulse quickened, and without thinking, he bolted from the church, the box clutched tightly in his hands. Outside, the mist had thickened, and the town seemed darker than before. The streets that had been so empty were now filled with an unsettling presence. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on him, that the very land itself was alive with malevolent force. He stumbled down the street, his breath ragged, but the mist pressed in around him, blinding his vision, making him lose his bearings. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of something, a voice, a whisper in a language he didn't recognize. It felt ancient, timeless. And with each step he took, the voice grew louder, closer. Henry glanced over his shoulder. The town was no longer silent. Shapes moved in the fog, figures cloaked in darkness, their forms indistinct. But they were there watching, waiting. And somewhere far in the distance there was a sound, a low, mournful bell tolling. Once, twice, 3 times. The last sound he heard before the town swallowed him whole was the eerie, distant sound of a child's laughter. A laugh that did not belong. That night the town slept as it always had. And as it always would. For those who dared to venture too far, the town still waited. The whispers of the swamp. It was well into the morning when the search party arrived. Henry Jacobs had disappeared into the mist without a trace, leaving behind only the unsettling memory of his sudden flight from the abandoned town. The elders, those few who still remembered the old stories, had feared this day would come. For they knew that the town, the desolate town as it was called in whispers, was not simply abandoned. It was cursed. And once someone stepped foot into its hollow streets, they would never leave the same way. The searchers, led by old Mabel, a woman whose weathered face was lined with the scars of time and regret, stood at the edge of the swamp that bordered the town. The air was thick with dampness and the scent of decay, as if the very ground itself was rotting beneath their feet. There was something unnatural about the swamp, something that made the birds avoid it and kept the animals silent. The water, dark and still, held a quiet secret that no one had dared to uncover. Mabel glanced at her companions, her eyes narrowing as she squinted through the fog. "We won't find him in there," she muttered, though her voice betrayed a trace of doubt. "That boy's already in the town. The curse has marked him." One of the men, younger and less familiar with the old tales, looked puzzled. "What do you mean, cursed? It's just an abandoned town. Nothing more." The older woman's gaze hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The desolate town isn't a place that just gets abandoned. People don't leave on their own, they are taken. And once you're taken, there's no coming back. Not until the town gets what it wants." A shiver ran down the spine of the man who had spoken. He had heard the stories but had never truly believed them. Now, standing at the edge of the swamp, with the fog creeping around them like ghostly fingers, he was starting to feel the weight of the town's ominous reputation. "Maybe the boy got scared and ran off," the man suggested weakly, trying to convince himself. Mabel turned to him, her face grim. "Don't fool yourself, boy. You saw him. His eyes, the way they looked when he came back from the church. It wasn't him anymore. It was the town. It does that to people. It makes them part of it." She shook her head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "The town is waiting. It always waits. And if you step foot inside, you'll never be the same. The spirits of the land, the old ones, they claim the living and make them part of the mist. They feed off their fear, their confusion, their regret. You don't even need to be dead to become one of them." A heavy silence settled over the group as they stared at the swamp. Somewhere in the distance, the muffled sound of a bell tolled, its deep ring echoing through the trees. It was as though the town itself was calling to them. But for what? For whom? Mabel turned away from the group, her gaze settling on the thick trees that encircled the swamp. "We can't go in the way we are. We'll need to find the old way. The path the townsfolk used to take before they disappeared." As she spoke, the wind howled again and the scent of pine and rot grew stronger. She paused, her brow furrowing as if something was stirring in the air, just beyond her reach. Without another word, Mabel started walking toward the thick forest, her boots crunching on the dry leaves that had collected on the ground. The rest of the search party followed, but there was an unease in their movements, a tension in the way they gripped their lanterns and rifles. They knew they were heading into something they didn't understand, something far older than they could grasp. The deeper they went into the woods, the thicker the fog became, swirling around them like a living thing. The trees seemed to close in, their trunks twisted and gnarled, with moss hanging like old rags. It was as though the forest itself was a maze, a place that had forgotten the rules of time. There were no signs of life here, only the strange, heavy silence that made every footstep sound too loud. Mabel led the group to an overgrown path, barely visible beneath the weight of fallen leaves and moss. As they stepped onto it, the fog seemed to grow thicker still, and the temperature dropped sharply. A chill ran down the spine of the youngest member of the group, a boy no older than 18 who had come along out of duty, but now felt an all-consuming dread. "Where are we going, Mabel?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "Follow me," she replied, her tone terse. "We're getting close." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, but he could feel something wrong in the air. Something ancient and malevolent. The fog had a weight to it now, as if it was pressing down on their shoulders, urging them to turn back. But they pressed on, deeper into the darkening woods, until they finally came to a clearing. It was there that they saw it, the broken remnants of what had once been the outskirts of the town. The buildings lay in ruins, their foundations cracked, their windows shattered. But there was something in the air, something that hummed and vibrated with an unnatural energy. A strange, glowing light flickered faintly through the windows of a long-abandoned house. Mabel approached it slowly, her hand resting on the old wooden door. "It's time," she whispered. "Time to find out what happened to the others." The rest of the group hesitated, their eyes darting nervously around the eerie scene. But they followed Mabel inside, where the air was thick with dust and the smell of mold. The house was empty, save for the remnants of belongings left behind. But there, in the center of the room, something caught their attention. A figure. It was Henry. He stood in the middle of the room, staring blankly ahead. His eyes, once full of curiosity and youthful vigor, were now hollow, dark pools that seemed to absorb the very light around him. His mouth was moving, but no words came out. It was as though he was speaking to something, or to someone. Suddenly the house creaked. The air turned colder and the shadows grew longer. A deep, rumbling sound vibrated from below, as if the very earth itself was awakening. The walls began to tremble, and in the distance, the sound of the bell tolled again. Once, twice, 3 times. And then the whisper began. The bell's call. The whisper that filled the room was like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, soft, sweet, and yet full of an ominous dread. It crawled into the minds of the searchers, echoing within their heads, as though the very walls were pressing against their thoughts. "Mabel," the young boy whispered, his voice trembling. "What is that?" Mabel's expression was grim, her eyes wide with the knowledge of the curse she had known all her life, but had never dared to speak of so openly. She stepped toward Henry, her hand outstretched, but she stopped just short of touching his arm. The boy didn't move. His body swayed slightly, as though caught in the grip of an invisible force. "It's the town," Mabel said softly. "It's calling him. It's calling all of us." The faint glow from the window flickered again, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, growing longer, darker. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and Henry's lips moved more urgently, but still no sound came. Henry's eyes met Mabel's, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition. There was no longer a trace of the boy who had entered the town days ago. In his gaze was something older, something far darker. The town had claimed him. "This place," Mabel whispered, stepping closer, "it doesn't just take the living. It turns them into part of the land. The fog, the shadows, the cold, everything here is tied to the souls that wander, lost, waiting for something they can never understand." The young boy, who had been standing at the back of the room, suddenly staggered forward, his hand outstretched toward Henry. What's happening to him, Mabel?" he cried. Before Mabel could answer, the room seemed to tremble again, as if the very air was filled with an energy that refused to be contained. The bell tolled once more, but this time it was not distant. It was right next to them, reverberating through the floorboards as if the bell itself was hidden deep beneath the town, hidden in a place even the town's buildings refused to reveal. Suddenly the room plunged into darkness. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, rising in volume until they were nearly deafening. The very walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows writhing and twisting, taking on forms that were not human, figures half-formed, with hollow eyes, mouths stretched into grins that never reached their eyes. They moved just at the edges of their vision, circling, waiting. The young boy screamed. It was a raw, guttural cry that echoed through the house and into the fog. He turned to Mabel, but she was already moving, her hand gripping his arm firmly. "Stay close," she urged. "We're not safe here. None of us are." But it was too late. Henry's voice, once lost in the empty space, finally rose into the air, the words coming in a low, guttural growl. The room seemed to stretch as he spoke, and his body shook with a force that wasn't his own. "The bell tolls for all who wander, for all who are lost." Henry's voice sounded both his own and not his own at once, like the town itself had borrowed it. The figures in the room moved, their forms shifting, like silhouettes in a fog, slowly converging on the group. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, frost appearing on the windows, the walls, and even on the breath of the living. The air became so thick with unease that it felt as though they were walking through a nightmare. "We have to leave," the young boy shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the growing hum in the room, a vibration that seemed to shake the very bones of the house. Mabel shook her head, a stern, resigned look on her face. "There is no leaving now," she whispered. "Not for him. Not for any of us." Once you hear the bell, once you feel the mist touch your skin, you are already part of it. The shadows pressed closer. The mist from outside flooded into the room, swirling like a living thing. The ground beneath their feet seemed to soften, as if it were turning to liquid, threatening to pull them down into the earth. But it was Henry's voice again, louder, more desperate, that broke through the suffocating terror. The town will never be forgotten. It never leaves. It waits. It waits for those who wander. The shadows now moved with purpose, closing in on Henry, on Mabel, on the others. It was as if the very town itself was feeding on the fear that radiated from them. They could feel it, growing, surging, an all-consuming hunger that had waited centuries to awaken. And then, with one final, deafening toll of the bell, the ground cracked open, splitting beneath them. The house groaned as it seemed to buckle under the weight of the curse, and Henry's voice fell silent. Mabel turned to the others, her expression grim but resolute. "Run," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm that now raged outside. "You have to leave. I'll keep them off you. Go." The others hesitated for only a moment, but the urgency in Mabel's voice spurred them into action. The young boy, tears streaming down his face, turned and bolted for the door. But just before he reached it, the house shuddered again, and a wave of cold air swept through the room. It was as if the very house was alive and aware. But Mabel did not look back. She stayed with Henry, with the town, and as the door slammed shut behind the others, the whispers grew louder. The last sound the group heard as they fled into the fog was Mabel's voice, soft and distant, calling one final warning. "The town will wait. It always waits. And when it calls again, you'll come." And so the town remained, silent, desolate, and waiting for the next wanderer, for the next soul to be claimed, for the next bell to toll.